Okay, so this is the exam review for exam 2, Soc 1. Alright, so first up, chapter 6, just the definition from your book of deviance, that it's a behavior, trait, or belief, or other characteristic that violates a norm and causes a negative reaction, right? We discussed in class how this has everything to do with your culture, meaning it's socially constructed what's right and what's wrong in a particular culture. So it means that you see that different cultures have different definitions of deviance. When it comes to the functionalist perspective in deviance, they see deviance as serving a function in clarifying moral boundaries. Conflict theory looks at deviance very differently. They see it as the result of social conflict, and that people in power are able to marginalize and criminalize people that threaten their power, and that inequality is reproduced through the way that deviance is exercised in the culture. Moving on to Merton's strain theory. The only two I'm going to test you on of all of his examples are just innovators and rebels. So innovators are people who accept society's goals, but they reject the means, the society's approved means to achieve their goals, right? So they want the goal of society, which is money, but they reject the approved means, which is, getting a college degree and getting a job. Rebels, though, basically create their own goals using their own means. They operate completely outside of that system. Let's see here. Differential association theory just argues that, who we associate with affects how we develop our own deviant identities, right? Let's see. Labeling is just a theory that's, really looking at how deviance is caused by external judgments that change someone's self-concept in the way, and also the way that they respond to themselves. Lady. Alright, labeling theory is a symbolic interactionist perspective, just saying that how we interact defines our meanings. So they say that deviance is caused by external judgments that change a person's self-concept and the way other people respond to them. A related concept is stigma, which is just any physical or social attribute that devalues a person or group's identity. And once you're stigmatized, you are separated from the normal group and excluded, right? You're not valued in social interactions. Passing is when you present yourself as a member of a different group than the stigmatized group that you are a part of. Deterrence versus retribution here, I just want you to know the difference between these kinds of models, right? Whether it's deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, retribution, all of those. So deterrence is a model where you're trying to prevent crime by threatening harsh penalties, right? Versus retribution is a retaliatory or revenge-like ideology regarding justice. Positive deviance is just deviance that's later interpreted as heroic, like when we talked about the kind of Rosa Parks / Claudette Colvin situation. Alright, moving into chapter 7. Social stratification is just the division of society into groups that are arranged in a social hierarchy. And since it's divided, that means some people have more power or privileges than others. Let's see. Social class is a form of social stratification that's based on wealth, power, and prestige. Intersectionality is just how different categories of our inequalities overlap and function together to have those kind of developed shared meanings. So such as our social class, or race, or gender, those things, that they all overlap. Karl Marx, right, when he was arguing through conflict theory, was that there's two main social classes in capitalist societies that remain divided, and as a result, social inequality grows. Weber kind of built upon this, saying that it wasn't just about the people who own the means of production, right, the capitalist class, but another way people could, gain a higher class status was by wealth and prestige. Cultural capital are just the habits, skills, or knowledge that help people gain advantages in society, right? Like knowing the right fork to use, or, in the case of college, knowing how to apply for college. Symbolic interaction theory looks at social class differently because they say we structure our meanings through our interactions. So they examine the way that we use status differences to categorize ourselves and to categorize others. Let's see, moving on, structural mobility. It's just when structural changes in society affect the status of all sorts of people and therefore change their social class status because of those larger structural issues. So, for example, the 2007-2008 kind of economic downturn meant that it wasn't as if a bunch of people just decided they were going to quit their job that day. A lot of people were laid off. Right? It wasn't as if people were like, I want to be homeless now. A lot of people lost their homes because of predatory mortgages. So that would be structural mobility, where you had millions of people moving into lower social classes because of a larger economic change that was resulting in a collapse of the world's economy. All right, culture poverty argument. Basically, that argument is that the poor have learned attitudes that make them remain poor so that they don't try hard enough, right? The theory was largely rejected for having very racist undertones because it's not being pointed at every group of people that are poor, and it's really largely rejected in empirical research. Let's see, absolute versus relative poverty. So absolute poverty is like you don't have the ability to meet minimal standards for food, shelter, clothing, or healthcare. Versus relative poverty is that you are poor compared to the standard of living in your own country, right? So like in our country, you would be in relative poverty for not having a cell phone, a television, air conditioning, but you would still hopefully be able to like eat food and survive, versus absolute poverty being like you don't even have clothes, you have no shelter, right? Alrighty, chapter 9. So just the difference here that sex is a biological category and gender is a social category that determines how we're supposed to act, right? Constructionists are people that think that gender roles come from the social construction of, a culture, so that, how gender develops has everything to do with the meanings in the culture, the historical time period, all that kind of fun stuff. Gender identity is just an individual self-definition of their gender. Right, pretty easy there. Sexual orientation is just your inclination towards, who you have sexual attraction towards. Kinsey's research, just how basically he did one of the most comprehensive sex studies in the 1950s, and he was suggesting that human sexuality was more diverse than people commonly assumed. So he actually created a scale of sexuality, right, where he measured people in responses on the scale of 6 to see where they fell in their expression of sexuality. So he basically looked at it more as a continuum, right? And he found that a lot of people had either same-sex contact or desires via that scale. Homophobia is just fear or discrimination towards homosexuals or towards people who display purportedly gender inappropriate behaviors, right? Oftentimes people conflate gender presentation, like how you walk, how you talk, how you dress, what your hair looks like, with sexuality, though those things are separate. Theories of gender inequality. So Talcott Parsons, functionalism, right? He believed that there were different roles for men and women in society, that men were better suited for instrumental roles and women were better suited for expressive roles, right? Instrumental roles meaning being the breadwinner, being the authority figure, right? Being kind of, aggressive, versus women were more suited for expressive roles, right? Being nurturing, being caring, that kind of stuff. And so he thought that these gender-specific roles helped society function. Let's see. Gender role socialization, just the definition from your book. It's the lifelong process of learning to be masculine or feminine, right? Typically through those agents of socialization, our families first, schools, peers, and of course the media. Alrighty, moving on. Feminization of poverty. So it's just the fact that women are more likely to live in poverty than men, and it's largely the result of structural issues like the fact that a lot of single parents are women and the costs of childcare are extremely expensive, the fact that there's a gender gap in wages, and also, just this basically puts more of a strain and stress on women in those situations, which means they're more likely to fall into issues of poverty. The 3 waves of the women's rights movement, right? All I need you to really know there is that the first wave was looking at women's right to vote. The second wave focused a lot on equal opportunity in education and employment, and of course, control over one's body, whether it was reproductive functions or, kind of actually acknowledging sexual harassment, sexual assault, things like that. And then the third wave focuses on more of a multiculturalism approach, looking at different groups of women, not just here in this country, but around the world, right? Acknowledging the plight of poor women of color, of lesbians, of just more marginalized groups of women. And then, of course, extending that analysis to men as well, and seeing how gender as a system really negatively affects men and puts a lot of expectations on their behavior and their roles that constrain their ability to be human. All right, so feminism is just, again, from the book, the belief in the political, economic, and social equality of all people. These two questions are in regards to the film we watched, right? That women are media and sexualization. Obviously, the film really argues that women are sexualized in the media, and that these images really affect the way that women actually see themselves, and that this extends to women's leadership, because seeing objectifying images affects women's political efficacy, which just means that if you see more women as sex objects, you're less likely to vote or run for political office. It also reflects the fact that when women are in leadership positions, especially in politics, the media often degrades them or treats them negatively, which also affects whether or not women will see themselves as appropriate to those roles or want to run for office when they see how negatively characterized women are. All right, chapter 8. So ethnicity is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or other cultural factors. Race is a social construction. It just means it's not based solely in biology. It has, racial categories have never really had firm boundaries, and they change over time, and that's how you can tell something socially constructed, is if it means something different from culture to culture, if it changes over time. And the distinction between race and ethnicity shows how ethnicity can be hidden, while race is always on display. So for the next ones, just, again, from definition from your book, colorblind racism is an ideology that removes race as an explanation for unequal treatment, right? Just pretends like history never happened and there hasn't been a long history of inequality that leads to unequal chances today. Prejudice is when you look at or you apply ideas about characteristics of one particular group to everyone within that group. Right? So you see someone that, let's say, based on their race or based on their gender, or based on their sexuality, you apply a stereotype to an entire group, based on some kind of flawed assumptions about the group. Discrimination is different. So prejudice is more about thinking negative things. Discrimination is about action, right? It's about unequal treatment of people based on their membership in a particular social group that is motivated by prejudice, but it can be individual or institutional. Institutional discrimination is systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions, right? Like we talked about disparities in the criminal justice system as one example of a social institution. And so that affects all members of a group who come in contact with it. When conflict theory studies race, they look at how, obviously conflict theory looks at struggles for power and control between groups that have power and don't have power within society. And they are often looking at the economic interests, right? How it's not just about race in the context of racial discrimination. There's also an economic incentive to keeping an entire group of people in poverty so that they can be used for low-wage labor to benefit the economic interests of capitalism. All right, internal colonialism is just the economic and political domination and subjugation of a minority group by a controlling group in a country. So South African apartheid, Jim Crow segregation, these are examples we talked about of internal colonialism. Assimilation is when a minority group is absorbed into the mainstream or dominant group, versus pluralism is when we encourage racial and ethnic variation in society. So we talked about the difference between, the melting pot, which if you kind of melt everything together, it's gross. It's like a weird stew. Unless it's fondue, that's delicious. But otherwise, it's kind of gross. So you just put a bunch of crap into a pan and melt it all together. Versus pluralism is more of that salad bowl metaphor, right? That you don't want just iceberg lettuce in your salad because that's awful. You want different kinds of lettuce. You want different kinds of veggies. You maybe even want some fruit in there, some blue cheese or whatever the crap it might be, right? Because that's what the diversity is what makes it better, right? All right, moving on to chapter 10, the last ones. So politics, again, these are just the definitions from your chapter, right? Social institutions themselves are basically groups or powerful forces in society that shape opportunities of individuals. And they are, they're not physical buildings as the way people tend to think of institutions. They're kind of social constructs that are built on stratified systems of power, right? So we talked about education is a social institution. Politics is a social institution, religion, etc. There's a bunch more, but those are the ones they talked about in the chapter. Politics is just policy-related attitudes that are intended to influence government politics. The power elite is C. Wright Mill's argument that a small amount of people have a lot of power in society and they get to make the important decisions about, everything that affects us in our country. And C. Wright Mills argues that this is composed of the most powerful people at the top of the scale in 3 different industries, in the political world, in the military, and in the government, right? So let's see, mass media. Dark money. Obviously, dark money just means that it's money that's not accounted for or doesn't have any representational strings attached to it. So nowadays, because of the Citizens United ruling of 2010, corporations are considered people, and therefore they can spend unlimited amounts of money in campaigns to reflect this idea of free speech for them. So since they're not actually people and they can't speak, speech is then seen as unlimited amounts of money. And so this has really kind of unleashed huge tidal waves of money into our political system, which is also why we see like 1 million people running for office every time there's a nomination, because now they can afford to do so because they can get enough money. And super PACs are basically taking original political action committees that had certain amounts of financial limits each person could contribute to, and in the same way, filling them with dark money. Super PACs do not have to actually tell you where the money came from, how much a donor gave, which means you can circumvent a lot of previously existing election integrity kind of rules. And oftentimes, we don't even know if this money is even coming from the U.S. It could just literally be coming from other countries, right, when it comes to super PACs, because there's no accountability. When it comes to media and politics, obviously media impacts us. When it comes to politics, we often only see horse race coverage. We see opinion leaders that are out there telling us what we should think about particular political events. And that really affects how we then interpret those events, right? When everything's being filtered through the media, that we aren't there in person. So in a way, what they portray to us and how they portray it really affects what we see as reality. Moving on to the education part, the Pygmalion effect is the idea that a teacher's attitude about a student's, performance, that it's going to affect how they actually do well in class. So if a teacher thinks, oh, this student is going to get an A, then that student is actually more likely to get an A. Then if a teacher thinks that a student is an underperforming student, we talked about the problems of tracking, right, and where oftentimes teachers are told before the semester starts, these kids are bad. And so, of course, that's going to affect the way they treat them. And that will literally affect the way that actually, they academically achieve. Fundamentalism is a religious understanding across all different religions of a kind of literal interpretation of the religion, or a return to greater religious purity, right? So these aren't people that see the Bible or the Quran or any other religious document as symbolic or trying to give lessons. They see it as a literal translation, and they act upon their religion in such a stringent way. Extrinsic versus intrinsic religiosity. Well, if you know the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic, then you got that one right. Extrinsic is just your personal public display, right, of religiosity. So this could be like, putting a bumper sticker on your car, wearing a crucifix, things like that. Showing publicly your religious faith, versus intrinsic religiosity is just your inner religious life or your personal relationship with the divine. All right, that's it for exam 2. Hope this is helpful.